Well, today what I'm going to do is talk about a book that I'm working on, which I call Discourse and Culture, an Introduction to Applied Discourse Analysis, Concepts and Applications. Is it on here? No, well, okay. You can see, well, it has topics and applications, the same thing. Generally speaking, when I write, I like to talk about a concept, and then I like to show how that concept can be applied, so you realize the concept has some significance. I could give you an example. Supposing we're talking about psychoanalytic theory, and you know someone who washes his hands 200 times a day, right? We have a term for that, right? What is it?
Can you repeat?
Washes the obsessive compulsive disorder. Let's see. So if you don't know the term obsessive compulsive disorder, all you know is this person is washing his hands 200 times a day. But if you know the term obsessive compulsive disorder, then you can understand what is going on. You read Mr. Freud and he explains what's behind it and all other kind of psychologists and so forth. So when I realized I was coming to this university, one of the world's centers of discourse analysis, I thought I should prepare for it by reading books on discourse analysis. And so it so happened that a publisher sent me a manuscript to review, to determine whether it should be published or not. And I had a choice of either getting a fee of $100 for my ideas or $150 worth of books. So I bought $150 worth of books on discourse analysis. So my library on discourse analysis is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then another one of my publishers owed me some books and so forth, so I got books from them, from Sage, Publications on Discourse Analysis. So I now have something like 8 or 10 books on discourse analysis. Now, the first thing I did is I read a lot of the books and I skimmed through many of them and so forth, and I looked at the indexes to see what topics they dealt with, the table of contents. So what are the topics that people who are writing about discourse analysis write about? You see. And so on the left-hand side are topics that I thought were sort of common to many of the books on discourse analysis. The first is, what is discourse analysis? How do you define it? The second is language, words, myths, humor, messages, a lot of things that I've also written about in other books. I have a chapter on intertextuality. This book that I've written is basically very intertextual. Do you know what intertextuality is? It means one text borrows from other texts. There was a Russian theorist named Bakhtin who said that all conversation is based on what was said in the past and what is anticipated in the future. And all texts are based on texts that were written before and so forth. So everything is sort of mixed up together. So this book is very intertextual in the sense that I borrowed from myself a great deal, which made it a little bit easier to write than if I had to make it all up myself. So I have identity, which I know is a big subject in the field. I have science, so I could talk about fashion. I have images, so I could talk about advertising and so forth. Well, one that I think will be interesting to you is my chapter on speed dating. Do you know what speed dating is? Do you know what speed dating is?
No.
Speed dating is a kind of bizarre experience in which a lot of men and women are gathered together and they sit down and number one will talk to number two for 5 minutes. Then they move on to the next person. So you have like 3 minutes to talk. That's speed dating. And the theory is if you find someone that you like, maybe you go out with them or something like that. So you only have a short amount of time to talk to this person. So it just so happened, get rid of this stuff. It just so happened that there was an article in the New York Times or one of these places about some very interesting results that a researcher found about speed dating. And the question is, why does this person who's speed dating with you go out with you and that person doesn't want to go out with you? See, and it has to do with language. See, so that's why I have my chapter. I thought after discussing what discourse analysis is, whatever it is, I'd say something about language and then later on about words. So let me find my chapter on speed dating. In the introduction, I mentioned Bakhtin. I said this, and I admit what this book is. I said this book, then, like all books, if Bakhtin is correct, is full of borrowings of quotations by theorists of interest and material and revised, updated, and transformed from my writings over the years. In all cases, when I borrow from others, I quote from them. So that is one thing students have to learn. You can borrow from other people, but you must just give them credit. Nothing wrong with borrowing them. The problem is when you borrow from somebody, you don't give them credit. That's plagiarism. In any case, so I have a chapter. I have before each chapter, I have quotes for something to think about. So I have a couple of quotes on what is discourse analysis and so forth. One from good old Toyn van Dyke, so forth. And so let me skip over that chapter because let's assume you know enough about discourse analysis. You don't have to worry about it. But no, here's a chapter on here's my chapter on language. So I have a theoretical chapter on language. I quote Saussure, and I mention other people who've worked on language and so forth and so on. And then I point out that discourse analysis seems to have grown out of linguistic analysis when the linguists moved beyond the sentence. I hadn't realized that linguistics professors were stuck with the sentence. But in 1950, this linguistics professor in America, I think, wrote this article, and that sort of got the whole thing going. And now linguistics professors are doing the same kind of stuff that I do, except that there's more of a focus on language. So I have a lot of stuff about language and so forth and so on. Then I have my application. So the idea is, if a book is going to be interesting to people, if you're going to teach them a concept, you have to show how that concept can be used in the real world. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything to you. That's why basically all of my books have the same structure. Like I have a book, Media Analysis Techniques. It explains 4 different techniques, and then in the second half, it gives the applications. You see. So I'm always using concepts and showing their applications, so that the concept doesn't just seem to be like an abstraction that doesn't have any meaning. So let me, so then I have the application on language and speed dating. So I'll read a little bit from that. See. A psychologist at the University of Texas at Austin, James Penamaker, has found that the language people use during speed dating sessions can be used to predict who will go out on a date with whom. So that's kind of an interesting thing, isn't it? This professor of linguistics, or whatever he is, by analyzing the language that the different people use, because he recorded all their language, he can predict which people are going to go out with other people. Okay, let's see. Penamaker makes a distinction between what he calls function words, as he explains, and this was taken from National Public Radio. Function words such as this, though, and I, and am, are filler words that were used between content words such as school, family, and live, which are related to the substance of what we are talking about and conjure in our minds specific images. See? So then I have a quote from the piece that was on National Public Radio. One nice thing about National Public Radio in America is everything is, you can use it and it's available in print form. So I heard this on the radio, this fascinating story, and then I went back to National Public Radio and I found the text that he had, the interview. One of the things that Penamaker did was record and transcribe the conversations that took place between people on speed dates. He fed these conversations into his program along with information about how people themselves were perceiving the dates. What he found surprised him. We can predict by analyzing their language who will go on a date, who will match, better than the people themselves. That is, if you ask the people themselves, do you think you're going to go this way? They may not know, but on the basis of their language, Pennebaker was able to predict who's going to go out with whom. Specifically, what Pennebaker found was that when language styles of two people matched, when they used pronouns, prepositions, articles, and so forth in similar ways, at similar rates, they were much more likely to set up on a date. So it's an interesting thing that your linguistic style, shapes who you're going to go out with. It may even shape who you marry. You find, why do people marry other people? Because their linguistic styles match. You could say, anyway. The more similar they were across all the function words, the higher the probability that they would go on a date in a speed dating context, Pennebaker said. And this is even cooler. We can even look at a young dating couple, and the more similar they are using this language, style matching metrics, the more likely they will still be dating 3 months from now. So he was able to discover that by looking at the language style that these speed dating people used, that if there's very strong similarities between their language style, three months later they'll still be dating. You see, it raises an interesting question about human relationships. The way language affects human relationships, because it's probably much more profound than we realize. Why people become attracted to one another? Well, they're using the same language to a large degree. This is not because similar people are attracted to each other, Pennebaker says. People can be very different. It is that when we are around people that we have a genuine interest in, our language subtly shifts. So the language then shifts to accommodate the person that you're interested in. You see, it isn't that you have a static style of language, it's that you adapt your language to the person. You're sitting across from this beautiful young woman, and you start using language that you adapt, that you think she would like. That looks really interesting. Let's see if I can. When two people are paying close attention, they use language in the same way, he says. And it is one of these things that humans do automatically. They weren't aware of it, but if you look closely at that language, count up the use of I's and thee and ands, you can see it's right there. So that's another important point, that much of what we do in language we're not aware of. That's what semiotics also suggests. You said everyone's a discourse analyst, you see. A semiotician would say everyone's a semiotician. Because even though you may not have studied semiotics, you look at the world in terms of the signs that you see, people's hairstyle, people's facial expression, their style of glasses, their body language. All of these things are signs to a semiotician. Well, it's the same thing with language. You aren't aware necessarily of the language you're using, but if someone records it, sometimes they can see things that you didn't realize.
Sorry, can
Yes.
I comment?
Yes.
Just a very short comment,
Yes.
brief comment within it. We used to play with students such a game. So students presented some text.
Yes.
And the task was that they need to, for themselves, to clear up with whom they speak.
Uh-huh.
And they wrote on a piece of paper with whom they intended to speak and start speaking. And the students were to find out with whom that person is speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And after this, each student is writing with whom and gives some examples, some words, some language examples to prove that that person spoke with that particular person. After that, we collected all the pieces of paper and checked who was right, who was wrong. But the idea for a teacher was also to do the same task. And so the teacher also followed the students' talk and marked. And when the student said, I spoke with that person, the teacher might say, but you did this and that expression in a wrong way. If you really were to speak with that person, you should have spoken in such a way.
Yes.
So the point is, we are learning how to speak with different people using different languages, and just both intentionally when you intend to speak with somebody, and by guessing, because sometimes when you are simply a listener and somebody is speaking with you, you are to find out just what are you for that person, and whether you accept this role or not, whether you want to continue communication or not. And then the role is your, so to say, index, whether to choose this person for speaking or not. So we may use it anywhere, not only in date speeding, but in speed dating, but everywhere.
Yes,
and that's very important for understanding people, and that is very important for using the proper language and for constructing communication and for constructing relationships. Thank you.
We have a term in America, different strokes for different folks.
Yeah.
And what that means is you adapt your language to the person you're dealing with. If you're dealing with a 3-year-old, you talk one way. If you're dealing with a neurosurgeon, you talk a different way. So we're always in the process of trying to figure out how to make our language fit with the person we're dealing with. So it's not unusual, for example, that these speed daters, they weren't necessarily aware of the fact that they were unconsciously looking for certain kinds of responses that would make this person attractive to them. And they would be changing their language style depending upon the person they're speaking with to make themselves more attractive to that person, and they would feel more attracted to that person, and that's why they would go out on a date. You know, it's kind of an interesting thing. You know. When two people are paying close attention, they use language in the same way, he says. And if one of these things that humans do automatically. So you see, this is something that is built into us. You learn to use the proper language depending on the situation you're dealing with. They aren't aware of it, but if you look closely at their language, count up the I's and the Th's, you can see it's right there. 1 second. So my thing is going on. The words reflect who we are. It's more than they drive who we are, he says. You can't, he believes, change who you are by changing your language. You can only change your language by changing who you are. He says that's what his research indicates. So one thing that you learn from this type of analysis is that your language is a reflection of yourself. You can modify it in certain situations and so forth, but if you want to change your language, basically you have to change who you are. And you can see that in life. As you become more highly educated, the language you use changes. You know, I remember years ago, I was taking a botany class. This was 1950. And I was in this botany lab, and I was describing something that happened. I said something lumps up. And the teacher said, "That's not the kind of language we expect from you, Mr. Berger. You know, more elevated language or something like that." But at that particular stage in my life, that's where I was, lumping up to describe that phenomenon. Well, I chose this example at the beginning of the book because I thought it would show people that that language plays a much more important role in our lives than we might imagine. You know. I actually once collaborated in a book with a semanticist named S.I. Hayakawa. You probably never heard of it. But he wrote a book called Language in Truth and Action. And this book, if I only could write a book like that, this book was very successful in high schools for about 40 years. You know, I collaborated in the 4th edition with him. He later became a senator. I mean, it was kind of a joke, but in any event, he was a semanticist at San Francisco State University. And he lived in Mill Valley, and I happen to live in Mill Valley too. So he asked me and another professor who also lived in Mill Valley to collaborate on this book. And what we did, he had written this book with all the theories, with all the descriptions of all the different things. And our task was to think up exercises and applications so that when students read that book, they would be able to sort of apply what they've read to their work. That probably had an effect on me, because almost every book that I've written always has this sort of application aspect to it, so that it doesn't just seem like an abstraction. Yes, there are these people who wash their hands 400 times a day, whatever it is. Or you know this concept. There is this obsessive compulsive disorder. It doesn't mean anything to you when somebody says, well, if somebody washes their hands 200 times a day or 400 times a day, they probably have obsessive compulsive disorder, which also manifests itself in other ways too. So I chose this particular article because I wanted to suggest to readers that that language is a much more important aspect of our lives than we might imagine. Most people, don't think much about the language they use. They just there are different codes that we learn. Like in England, there was a social linguist named Basil Bernstein. Is his work known here? Yeah. Well, Bernstein discovered something very interesting. That there are two codes that are used in England. One is the sort of the workman's code, and one is the sort of the middle class, upper class code, and they're different in almost every respect. And the point that Bernstein makes is that when you learn the code, it sort of shapes your notion of the future. If your code is present-minded, you don't think about the future. See, whereas if you're an upper middle class person, you learn a code, that code is very much concerned about the future and things like that. So what happens in England, he argued, is that the class differences are to a large degree linguistic. Children who are brought up in working class families don't learn what he called the elaborated code. The elaborated code is complex, it realizes negations and things like that. People who are brought up in working class families don't learn that code, and so they're sort of present-minded, and that sort of shapes the way they function in the future. So this is the second chapter in my book that I thought might be of interest to people. You could see that even something that seems as crazy as speed dating, our use of language affects who we decide to go out with, and that kind of thing. Yes?
This time it's a question.
Yes, question.
So you started with the language, and language is considered to be the most important within discourse analysis for you. But I wonder why identity goes like 13. So I mean that it is so called when we speak about language of people's representation and their relationship presentation, and identity seems to be very important immediately. Why it is so far?
Okay.
Can you speak on identity? Because this topic is really a burning topic for our research. 3 people from our department are doing research in identity.
Well, the first thing you have to realize is that this table of contents is going to be modified. That is, I'm going to put intertextuality right up the very top, because this book is basically a study of intertextuality. It uses material from other people. That is what intertextuality, and it uses stuff that I've written in this context. So, now identity, identity, this is a subject I'm very much interested in also, because I have written a murder mystery in identity. It's called Mistaken Identity. And in this murder mystery, someone who's very similar to Marshall McLuhan. Do you know Marshall McLuhan's work here? You don't know Marshall McLuhan. You know it, but you don't know it. Marshall McLuhan? Oh yes, no. Marshall McLuhan is one of the great media theorists of the time. He died a number of years ago, but he wrote a book called Understanding Media that talked about the media and its the way it shapes our culture and things like that. And he's very, very influential. I actually happened to meet Marshall McLuhan when I was living in San Francisco. He came to visit, and he was at an advertising agency. So I just called up the advertising agency. I said, I'd like to meet Marshall McLuhan. Come on over. They said, this is a very famous, you have to read, he's a very famous guy. And then he was nice enough to write the introduction to one of my books. So he was I wrote this book on television, And the editor said, well, let's get someone famous to write the introduction. So they contact somebody. He said, I'd like $10,000 to write the introduction. You have to realize that's absurd, that's ridiculous. This book is not going to make $10,000. So I wrote to Marshall McLuhan, and he wrote the introduction for nothing, because that's the way academics work, basically, in any case. So identity has always been a subject of tremendous interest to me. So in this book, someone like Marshall McLuhan is murdered on a cruise ship. He's murdered on a cruise ship that is docked in San Francisco. And my detective, I have this detective who's been in many of my murder mysteries. My detective goes onto the cruise ship to investigate, because he's a homicide investigator. And he has an assistant with him. And they know that someone on that ship has murdered Marshall McLuhan, but they don't know who. And he's sitting at this table with colleagues. And they all have different perspectives on identity. So what the detective does is he interviews at one time or another each of the people sitting around that table, and each of whom has a different concept of identity. Like for one, for example, he interviews a psychiatrist whose name has Freud in it. I put it in somehow or another. And they're walking on the deck of this ship, which I will be walking on in a few weeks, heading down to Mexico in the warm weather. And he has a theory about identity that we have anonymous identities, that we're all anonymous. We don't know who we are. You see, in the postmodern society, we spend so much time sort of creating this identity and that identity and another identity that we sort of lose track of who we are. So basically what we have is we have tricked ourselves. We don't even know who we are. So that's why he calls it an anonymous identity. Now, if I'd known you were so interested in identity, I'd have brought the book. Maybe I'll send you the file if I can find it. It was actually published by one of my publishers, and it is used in courses on identity or whatever. So let me see if I can find what I have on identity.
While you're finding it,
Yes.
I may just say some words to the students why we are interested in identity. In the context of Belarus, it's very interesting to find out what is the identity of a Belarusian. At the same time, there are many functional identity models because they cannot be just one person or one prototypic model. Prototypic, yes, it can be, but it's too general. It's not functional. You may just see what values there can be and just combine it, but it doesn't function. Like if to accept it metaphorically, a pathologoanatomist understands everything about a person, but the person is not alive. So specialists in different fields of medicine all together try to find out how the body is functioning and what each particular functional system adds to its fullness of life, so to say. And that is metaphorically, but within the identity, it is every person is functioning, and at the same time, in one person, there are many functional models. What is it that we can call a national identity, and what is something specific? What is quite explicit and what is implicit or anonymous, like Professor Berger said. So the research is really interesting from different points of view: psychology, sociology, philosophy, and you can study it from any. You can have any start to study it. For example, the idea of success. So how we view success, how we just accept it or not accept it, how we build it, and so on and so forth. And by doing it, you are presenting your identity with it. So it can be you may go from activity, you may go from time, you may go from any other category, but you might find finally the same models and they would represent people. So you are future specialists in communication, and this topic might be also interesting for you. But it's a point of search. You can't give an answer. You can have only some hypothesis
Oh, I can,
on it,
yes,
but you need
yes.
to set it.
It turns out
Thank
I
you.
have 2 chapters on identity in here.
Yeah.
Yes. Identity 1 and identity 2. I'll say a little bit. I can't find it, but I'll say a little bit. I'll say a little bit about it. Yes, I'll say, yes, right. There's a very interesting book called The Culture Code by a French psychoanalyst and marketing expert named Clotaire Rapaille, Rapaille. I was really fascinated when I read this book. I read it and I reviewed it for a magazine called Society. And what Rapaille argues is that our identities are sort of created the first 7 years of our lives. That is, he said, young children are sort of, I don't want to use the word brainwashed, but they're sort of given, they're given the basic concepts, notions, and so forth that are going to shape their behavior when they get older. Let me see if I can find him here. Let's see. Rapaille. He might be in here. He's certainly in some of my other books. Oh, here it is, right here. Wonderful thing, these computers. Okay. A French psychoanalyst and marketing expert, Clotaire Rapaille, wrote a book called The Culture Code, an ingenious way to understand why people around the world live and buy as they do. Which deals with differences between various societies and how these differences are maintained. He argues that between the age of 1 and 7, each national culture imprints children with the codes of that culture or subculture. So between the ages of 1 and 7, your parents are basically, and your school teachers and everything else, they're imprinting you with the culture, which means when you grew up French, you have your salad after the main course. When you grow up American, you have your salad before the main course. I think I might have talked about this before, that French have a different attitude toward cheese than Americans do. Rapaille said that Americans see cheese as dead. And since it's dead, we wrap it in cellophane and put it in the refrigerator. The French see cheese as alive, and since it's alive, they put it in a little container called a cloche or something like that, and leave it out and let it get gooey and smell and all of that kind of stuff. He also has stuff about Japanese culture and many other cultures, because what Rapaille did was he was asked by different corporations to sort of get the Japanese to be interested in coffee. How do you get the Japanese interested in coffee? Well, he went to Japan, he did things and so forth. You have to sort of deal with their identity. You have to understand what their identity is and see if you can sort of use their national identity to sort of influence them to start drinking coffee, you see. Or, let me read a little bit from it. He said, most of us imprint the meanings of the things that are central to our lives by the age of 7. This is because emotion is central force for children under the age of 7. An imprint and its code are like a lock and its a combination. If you have all the right numbers and all the right sequence, you can open the lock. Doing so over a vast array of imprints has profound implications. It brings us to the answer of one of our most fundamental questions. Why do we act the way we do? And he says, understanding the culture code, understanding the way people are imprinted, helps you understand why they are. Why is it that people, sometimes when they're very old, still remember fondly the food that their mothers made them when they were little kids? Because they've been imprinted when they were very young to certain foods that they like. You see. For Rapaille, identities to a large degree national. There are national identities, and these national identities involve things like food, attitudes towards sex, anything you can sort of mention that is sort of in that particular culture and in that way that particular culture functions. You see. Now, when I went into American Studies, my degree is in American Studies. What interested me about American Studies was I learned a lot about America, but I was wondering, how are we different from other cultures? What does it mean to be an American? Well, it doesn't mean anything unless you can sort of contrast that with what other cultures do. You see. Like an American breakfast, vaguely similar to the British breakfast, because we have a lot of our roots in England. And in the course of my travels, I remember my wife and I were walking in Cyprus, and there were these signs: traditional British breakfast, bacon and eggs and sausage and potatoes, all of that kind of stuff. Well, that's the way British are brought up, and that's the way they eat breakfast. Although that's changing probably now. In America, we used to have substantial breakfast, and now a lot of kids just drink Coca-Cola. Kind of crazy. So there is a national aspect to identity. And as I pointed out in the discussion of this linguist, Basil Bernstein, there's a social class aspect to identity. If you are brought up in England, I don't know whether it would still apply now that they have so much television and the people who speak on television are so different from the way they used to be. But when I grew up, to be English mean you spoke like the Queen did. That's the way the English spoke. And I remember when I was in the Army, a friend of mine, he was an Anglophile. He went over to England, and for 2 weeks, he was on leave for 2 weeks. When he came back, he's completely disillusioned. He thought all the British spoke like the Queen. But most of the British don't speak like the Queen at all. You can't hardly understand some of the British because of their crazy accents and so forth and so on. So the class in which you're born plays an important role in the language you use, the language codes, and those language codes then to a certain degree shape the way you behave, the way you perceive the future and your prospects in life. If I have any more, here's the application of identity. I have 2 chapters on identity because it comes up at different times, and I realized the reason I wrote about identity is because they wrote about it in these books on discourse analysis. Here's my discussion of remember that professor who was on the ship and says we have anonymous personalities. To have an anonymous personality means you don't have a personality. You just don't know who the hell you are. You just function. I don't want to go into it in detail. Let's see. I can read what he said. Okay, I can read you what he said. I called him Dürfklein. Now, the name Dürfklein is a combination of Freud and Melanie Klein. Melanie Klein was an important psychoanalyst, so I called him Professor Dürfklein. Dürf is Freud backwards. So someone is talking to me. He says, someone, I can't recall, mentioned that you have a fascinating theory about identity, namely that we're all imposters, or something like that. Dürfklein laughed. Yes, imposters, that's the word. My theories really bother my colleagues because they tend to look at human beings in aggregates, as members of society or some class or culture or subculture, so they can talk about things like behavior in crowds or American identity, whatever that might be, or various ideological programs that still deal with a large number of people, women, gays, people of color, the proletariat, you name it. My focus, since I've studied psychoanalysis, is to approach things, it deals with individuals and how they achieve their identities, or don't achieve them, since many people, in my theory, are pretenders to an identity. So Professor Dürfklein argues many people don't really have an identity, they just pretend to have an identity. You see, he calls it an anonymous identity. So my detective says, I don't understand how that can happen, says the detective. Somebody told me that in postmodern societies, people change their identities to suit their whims, but that doesn't seem to be the same thing as pretending to have an identity or being an imposter. So the professor smiled. You must remember that the term personality is based on the Latin root persona, and that means mask. So our personality is a mask. You see. If somebody asks me about you, what's her personality like, they'll tell me such and such and such. But we have to remember that that personality is the mask that you project to others. So we have to make a distinction between personality and what a person is really like. You must remember that the term personality is based on the Latin root persona, which means mask. So our personalities are, it can be said, masks that we create to deal with others in social situations. You might contrast one's personality with what might be called one's character or self, one's true being. What I argue, based on my work with numerous patients, is that many people never grow up, never cast off immature notions and fantasies of what it means to be an adult, never achieve coherence and continuity in their sense of themselves. So what you get ultimately is a fake person, a simulation, a fraud. And these people can't help themselves because they don't even know that they are imposters. They've devoted all their energy to faking others, and so they've ended up faking themselves, you see. So this was an opportunity for me. The nice thing about writing novels is you can put whatever theory you want into somebody's mouth. You can talk about whatever you want and so forth. But it struck me that I was using this professor to talk about a problem we face, namely that there is a problem of trying to understand people. People's identity is a kind of construct, and in many people what we find is they actually are pretenders. You know? There are a lot of people, there are a lot of people in America who drive around in big fancy cars, but they don't have a nickel in the bank, you know, because they're so consumed with status. So they have a big fancy car, but they go home and they eat macaroni 7 days a week. You know? And then there are other people. It's such an interesting subject. There are some very wealthy people who dress poor. Extremely wealthy people, they drive around in battered old cars. They have old, comfortable clothes. So you look at them and you don't have the slightest idea of what their real identity is, because they're living in a $10 million mansion. But they have an old car that's 30 years old from the family, and so forth and so on. So it's very difficult trying to, and this is also a semiotic problem, trying to sort of figure out who's what, because we have all these pretenders, you know. And there's a book called Collective Search for Identity by a sociologist who talks about all the different kinds of identities that people have. For example, he points out in America there's a group of people who look like motorcycle drivers. They have leather jackets, they have boots. The only thing they don't have is motorcycles. But they're getting their kicks, you see, pretending to be motorcycle drivers. So it's a fascinating book, because if you're interested in identity, you might want to read it. He talks about all the different poses. I mean, some people are sort of want attention, so they dye their hair purple and, you know, all that kind of stuff. He calls them identity screamers. So it's a very interesting subject, and I can understand why the discourse people are interested in it, because they're interested in knowing why people do what they do, you know, social interaction. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The very last sentence, I have thought about it as well when you pronounced it, and I thought that discourse analysts like we are reconstructing and trying to understand how this identity is built. Yeah. As for you, you're constructing it in your novels. You're just inventing some heroes and present different identities and really fill all those categories and elements and represent them when they start to be alive. That's an interesting way of research, to construct reality.
Everyone is what I call a people reader. You know what people reading means? People reading? It's a term we use in America. You're at a cafe and you're having coffee with someone, and people walking by. You're looking at those people. You're looking at their facial expression. You're looking at their hairstyle. You're looking at their clothes. You're looking at what they're carrying. You're looking at what props they have, what kind of glasses they have, and so forth. From all of those things, you're trying to construct what those people are like. That's what we call people reading, you see. But what we know is that people make many mistakes in trying to understand the way people are. Somebody's smiling. Well, ordinarily, smiling is a sign that you're happy about something, but it also could be a smile because you've done something terrible to someone and you're happy about it. So it isn't always as simple as it seems.
And sometimes they say that smiling is weakness. So
yes,
strong people are not smiling.
Yeah, you smile out of
those who
weakness,
want to
yes.
just construct them
Yes.
to be strong.
See, the point is
powerful.
there's no one meaning to a lot of these signs. That is, there's many different possibilities to these signs. When you're looking at a person's facial expression, I mean, we know there's the world's expert on facial expression is in San Francisco. And he's written many books on facial expression and so forth. We know, for example, that there are 42 muscles in the face that we use to make facial expressions. And when people smile, there are two smiles, a fake smile and a real smile. So he could tell you the difference between a fake smile and a real smile. But also people can't even judge facial expression because in the course of my career wandering around the world and giving lectures, I've given lectures in many places and I've shown there are 8, this professor has found on the basis of his research, there are 8 universal facial expressions. There are many facial expressions, but there are 8 that are everywhere. And so I have a slide in which I have the 8 facial expressions. And I give people a piece of paper and say, tell me what one. I give them the list of the 8 facial expressions. I show them the facial expressions. I tell me what is number 1, what is number 2, what is number 3. They usually get them wrong. Really? Because it's very difficult to interpret facial expressions. Sometimes they're similar between like one and another. Like between ecstatic happiness and hatred, you know, it's pretty easy, but sometimes it's very difficult to determine.
It's culturally biased.
Is what?
Culture bias.
Well, no, because you see, these are universal. It's not a cultural bias. That is, he got, I mean, he's a very famous professor. He got a grant, went all around the world studying facial expression and determined there are 8 facial expressions that are universal. This doesn't mean there are only 8 facial expressions. There are many facial expressions, but there are 8 that are everywhere. So the question is, can we, on the basis of these facial expressions, I'm going to give you a list of the facial expressions. I'm going to show you the facial expression, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. And I'm asking you, tell me what this facial is, what that one is. Generally speaking, people make a number of mistakes.
We have a wonderful, just a Russian language functioning, no, it's even non-language. It's theater that presents everything by facial expressions, by movement, and this theater is called Maski. Have you seen it? And there is one kind of an enterprise there. The person is just showing with his face and movements some expression, and somebody pronounces it. Think hard, speak and think. And when he said speak, it was one expression. Yes. When he said speak and think, it was another expression. Yes. And then he said speak and think what you speak. And it was the third expression. Yeah, just wonderful. Find it in YouTube.
On YouTube, what is it called?
I will find out and I will send you yes.
Well, you see, in a very real sense, the matter of American identity has pervaded a lot of my work, and in a lot of my books I have a chart in which I talk about the difference between American identity and, say, European identity. See, we're individual, not the way it actually is, but the way we perceive it to be. We see ourselves as individualists. We see Europeans as sort of class-bound. You see, we see ourselves as being able to rise in the world on the basis of our effort. We see people there sort of stuck, maybe on class, maybe if there are revolutions or something. So I have a whole long list of differences between American character and European character. Now, Emerson wrote a poem, "Land without history, no kings, no cathedrals, land of the people." You see, so Europe is kings, we have presidents. You know, Europe is cathedrals, we have churches, Protestant. I mean, all of these things. Europe is aristocracy, we have democracy. So in the mind of many Americans, we sort of define ourselves by being un-European. And defining Europe the way we want to define it isn't necessarily true, but that's the way we sort of do it. Yeah.
So that's identity by what we are not.
Look, so Saussure said that concepts have their meaning by being not what the other thing is. So in a sense, yes, your identity is by being what others are not. Yeah. Anyway.
Some more questions as we have
some questions,
5 minutes, and this session will be over. Maybe
Anyone
students have questions.
You have any questions?
Not yet?
you could write them down in Russian and give them to her, and because I know that the students are often afraid to speak in English.
Their English is okay.
Their English is okay?
If you're not
We're afraid to say anything.
Wrote them, they're good.
Okay, no problem. No one had any questions? Okay.
I've got a
Yes,
question.
okay, good.
Just to sum up this part of the talk, what do you think is the reason to do discourse analysis? Why to analyze discourses? Why to analyze identities?
Yes. Well, yes.
Why?
Yes. Why do we?
Why?
Well, there are many different reasons for that. One is you can get a job teaching discourse analysis in universities. Another is because we're curious about why people act the way they are, think the way they are, and so forth. And the notion is, you see, like the semiotician in me says, oh, I'm really interested in signs. I'm looking at your facial expression, your hairstyle, the clothes you're wearing, the brand of this, your body language, and all that kind of stuff. The discourse analyst is saying, I'm interested in people too. I want to know, and how do we know about people? Well, one of the most important ways we know is what they think and say and write and things like that. So discourse is one of the many ways we have of trying to find out why people are the way they are, why they act the way they do, and all of that kind of stuff. The nice thing about discourse is a lot of it is written. So you can look at written discourse. You can write down conversations instead of the conversations. And now, thanks to multimodal critical discourse, you can study Facebook and have fun with that. But you see, what's the difference between a discourse analyst studying Facebook and a cultural theorist studying Facebook? Like, I'm a cultural critic, and I'm studying Facebook. A discourse analyst is studying Facebook. What's the difference? Maybe the discourse analyst is a little more interested in the language, perhaps a little more interested in the language, because you're all basically linguistics professors who escaped from the confines of the sentence, as I see it. You know. Beyond the sentence, that's what they all say. Discourse, beyond the sentence. So that might be an element
In
of it.
spite of the
Oh, in
sense.
spite of the sentence. In any case, you see, we're all after the same thing. We want to know why people are the way, act the way they do, think the way they do, behave the way they do. So forth. All qualitative social science is sort of interested in that question. Yeah.
And I think you would agree with me that to do discourse analysis means to stay young, because you're always curious about
Yes.
something,
Yeah.
about the world, and so that's the position of
Yeah.
really young people.
Yeah.
Because just grown-ups are not interested in anything, they know everything. And discourse analysts still continue to wonder, what's it all
Well,
about?
you know, it's kind of interesting because when I want to find out about some subject, I like to write a book about it. See, if I know all about it, there's nothing. So here I know I'm coming to this place, and it's full of discourse analysts. But I wanted to write a book that's different from other books, you see, because all of the other books I have tend to focus more at the theory level, you see. I have spent many years of my life fighting with professors who love theory. They love semiotic theory, they love Marxist theory, they love psychoanalytic theory, and so forth. The only problem is when they teach these courses, they don't teach their students how to do anything with them, you see. So I have always tried, and this book is a good example, I've always tried to marry theory with application. Without the application, the theory is sort of abstract and vague. You know. So that is why this book says, you know, it says concepts and applications or something like that in the subtitle. You see, because knowing the concept is useful. You know, I make a distinction like a theory, psychoanalytic theory. Then there's the concepts within psychoanalytic theory, the Oedipus complex, all of that kind of stuff. So you use the concepts from the theory to analyze behavior.